Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today we are resuming our series that we've called Fixing Democracy, about some of the ideas that could, just possibly, make democracy work better. Today I'm talking to Professor Alan Renwick from University College London's Constitution Unit about an aspect of democracy that has a pretty bad name at the moment, the referendum. But we're going to be talking about some of the ways in which referendums can, and maybe even should, enhance democratic politics. But don't worry, we will also be talking about some of the ways in which referendums can go wrong. You can guess which referendum we're talking about. Alan, my guess is that for a lot of people listening, not just in Britain, but in other parts of the world too, referendums maybe have a bit of a bad name. I don't know. We can talk about where they stand currently in public consciousness, but particularly in Britain, I think the referendum idea has had a rocky, well, let's say decade. But maybe we should start looking at it the other way round, because there are lots, certainly some, and maybe lots of reasons for thinking that referendums are useful, sometimes essential devices in democratic politics. What do you think is the ideal case for referendums? Is there a plausible argument that the referendum is a kind of pure democracy that cannot be captured through other versions of our modern democratic system? Are you willing to make that case?
Well, I think on one dimension of democracy, you can make that case, which is that referendums are unmediated, or at least they appear on the surface to be unmediated mechanisms by which the public can make a decision on a concrete issue. So, with representative democracy, clearly the decisions are mediated through our representatives, and there are all sorts of legitimate concerns about how far those representatives are genuinely pursuing the public interest versus some sectional interest or their own interest or whatever it might be, whereas referendums, at least on the surface, are unmediated. But I guess I hesitate to make that argument because that's only one dimension of democracy, and there are just all sorts of other really important aspects of democracy. So one point is that, well, democracy is not just pure majority rule, and referendums are majority or supermajority rule. So, democracy has to have regard to the interests of people in the minority as well. And in a parliamentary process, ideally you have all of the various voices represented in Parliament and being heard and hopefully being listened to before a decision is made, whereas there's no mechanism by which those voices are necessarily heard in a referendum. In addition to that, a referendum involves a vote on something or other, but who decides what you're voting on? What's the process for selecting the issue that goes to the ballot paper? You have to think about that as well. And then, I guess in some ways, for me, most fundamentally and most importantly, democracy isn't just about voting, but it's also about thinking through the issues and working out what you think. So it's not just about expressing what you think, it's also about working out what you think. And just having referendums makes no guarantee at all that we have any sort of reasonable process of thinking through the options that are available, deliberating about the strengths and weaknesses of those options. So I think democracy is a very multidimensional thing, and referendums max out on one dimension, but they're quite weak in some ways on other dimensions. So, they're really quite problematic in some ways.
Yeah, and I think any system that just relied or even primarily relied on referendums would be very lopsided. But that word you used at the beginning, that it is unmediated, do you think that there are, and I don't know whether there are questions or types of questions, or there are moments in a political system, in a elected representative system, when there has been too much mediation and a bit of unmediated democracy could be bracing, useful, clarifying. And also the other thing about describing it as unmediated is the things that are effectively barriers in the way of the public deciding in representative systems can over time exclude certain kinds of people from wanting to take part altogether. And there is a sense in which the clarity of a referendum, its weaknesses on some measures are strengths on others. So its weakness, it's putting a question, often a binary question, a yes-no question when the issue is more complicated. But the strength of it is that the question is usually clear, comprehensible, and often one that speaks directly to people. So is there a case for saying that, and we'll talk about whether it's on questions or at moments or at particular junctures of frustration or difficulty in the system, that most, maybe all democracies do sometimes need that unmediated connection with the people, which perhaps can only be achieved in the form of a referendum?
Yeah, well, I think there's certainly a real problem in democracies at the moment with a sense of over-mediation, if you like, and a sense that elites are in the way and are not adequately listening and are pursuing their own interests. So, we see trust in politicians really scraping along at the bottom. I mean, it's been low for a long time, at least on some questions. It always just depends what question you ask people about trust, quite what answers you get. It's been low for some time, but it's very clear that it really is at rock bottom. And overcoming that does require that we either can somehow leap over that intermediator, or we can get a much better relationship with the intermediator, and we can get a better conversation going on between electors and their representatives. I guess I'm a bit hesitant about the idea that referendums are a good way of doing that. You can make a case. So if you look at the two referendums that have taken place in the UK in the last decade and a little bit, so the Brexit referendum and just before that the Scottish independence referendum, had very high turnout, and they had large numbers of people coming out who don't normally take part in elections and who feel that those elections are just pointless because the politicians are not going to listen and not going to pay attention anyway. And, the Scottish referendum had the highest turnout of any large-scale vote there has ever been in the UK. We tend to think of turnout as being much lower now than in the 1950s, and in general it is, but actually that referendum had higher turnout than in any election there has ever been in the UK. So, you can see that those referendums were responding to a public desire to voice something that they felt was not being voiced within the political system at the political elite level. But I guess my caution comes from the fact that, I kept saying at the start there, in a sense, they're not mediated. In a sense, we can talk about this unmediated form of democracy. But of course, the reality is that they are mediated because how people think about the issues that they're voting on in a referendum is very heavily mediated by campaigners and the media and the discourse that is going on. So the idea that somehow we get back to a pure expression of the voice of the people that is not in practice mediated by powerful political elites who may be pursuing their own interests rather than the public interest, I think is a bit too simplistic.
Having said, there is potentially at least an ideal case to be made for referendum. So the more you talk, the more I think it's very, very hard to sort of hold on to it for long. There is, of course, also the other case that is often made, which is not simply that this is a very skewed version of democracy, but it's that bit of democracy that can be carved off from the rest and just adopted by people who have no democratic principles or interests at all as a sort of piece of plebiscitary window dressing. And that is a view that has often been held, and it's been held by people including Margaret Thatcher, who notoriously, before the 1975 referendum on Europe, said that the referendum is a device of dictators and demagogues. By the time she was removed from office 15 years later, she was quite keen on referendums. And then in a post-prime ministerial career, she was very keen on there being a referendum on Britain's potential membership of the euro. But before all of that, she made the case, which had also been made by Clement Attlee, had been made by Roy Jenkins and others, that where you see referendums being used, you should actually be very suspicious, because this is a version of democracy that's almost free-floating above actual democratic principles and can just as easily be adopted by non-democratic regimes. Is that plausible? So that feels to me like it goes a bit far the other way. There are, of course, ways that non-democratic regimes can use plebiscitary politics, but we can talk about the referendum and describe it in terms that would make it hard for it just to be a sort of equal opportunity device for dictators and demagogues.
Yeah, I mean, you can run a referendum in a way that is highly manipulated and serves the interests of those in power and allows them to legitimate a decision that otherwise they might struggle to legitimate. So Attlee, when he criticised referendums in 1945, was thinking back to the referendums run by the Nazis, the Anschluss referendum in Austria, for example, in 1938, which, was utterly manipulated and yielded a result that I think it was 99.7% of those voting on a 99 point something percent turnout supported Austria's unification with Germany. And much more recently, we can see Putin holding referendums in the occupied territories in Ukraine in 2022 and also getting 99% plus votes in favor of their annexation into Russia, on the basis clearly of a highly skewed process. So we can see the referendum device being used in this manner. I mean, it's much harder to use a referendum in anything like that way in a proper democratic system. But it just highlights the fact that if you are using referendums, then it's absolutely essential to think about all sorts of safeguards to ensure that, you have a level playing field, you have opportunities for people to hear both sides of the argument and genuinely reflect on the options and come to their own considered view rather than a view that has been unduly skewed by propaganda.
Those examples that you give with 99% plus turnout, 99% plus endorsement of the approved policy, they feel like they almost belong in a separate category from any democratic process which produces an outcome where there is clear evidence of a genuine division. So even if Putin held a referendum, if the result of that referendum were 70-30, 65-35, let alone 52-48, my feeling would be some part of that had escaped his control. Maybe he had engineered it so that it came out just competitive enough to look legitimate, but nowhere near competitive enough to pose a risk to whatever he wanted to do, in which case, sort of good luck to him. But I have a sense that there's almost a numerical, I don't know where the threshold is, but a cutoff point where genuinely competitive referendums, even held under political systems that may not be democratic in most of the ways we might want, have some jeopardy in them. I mean, there's something a little unmediated if there is at least the possibility of large numbers of regular people voicing the idea that they don't agree. At a minimal level, there is something democratic about that.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Whether the process, however, yields an outcome that genuinely reflects what people will be happy with in the long term and that they will be confident to look back on and say, we made a reasonable decision, given what was known at the time, we made a decision that was sensible and that we're content with. That's the kind of criterion that I think we ought to be applying in order to think about whether a referendum has been run well or not. And I think many referendums in democratic countries don't really match that criterion.
And I want to talk to you about the ways in which you think they could work better. But before we get to that, as I said at the beginning, the case for a referendum is sometimes because certain kinds of questions are better suited to this kind of politics. And usually it's either questions of conscience or questions of constitutionality. There might be other themes too, but those I think are the two main ones. But a variant on that theme, it's not the same justification, is there are some things that legislatures just find really difficult to do. And it might include deciding how to reform themselves, or there might be a question of conflict of interest or whatever. Or it might be that on matters of conscience, the claim of the representative in the parliament to somehow be able to speak for people is a little more strained than it might be on some other questions where there's a more clear party divide or whatever. Do you think it is possible to characterize the questions that suit a referendum, or do you think it is more often ad hoc and it's simply whichever country you're in, the system reaches a point where the referendum suggests itself as a way out?
So a lot of referendums are on constitutional issues, and there are good arguments for why constitutional issues are better suited to referendums, or at least why decision-making by normal representative processes are particularly ill-suited. So, one argument is around sovereignty, that in a democracy there's a fundamental principle of popular sovereignty, but the electorate, in a sense, lend sovereignty to Parliament for the duration of a Parliament. But in lending sovereignty for that period, you're not giving Parliament the power to give away sovereignty on a large scale. So, just like if you rent a flat, you're not thereby allowed to knock down all the walls and make major renovations. Similarly, if voters are lending their sovereignty to representatives, then the representatives are not allowed to just do anything with that sovereignty. And I think that is quite a good argument, and I think it's a very widely recognised argument, which is why it's fairly uncontroversial that questions like EU membership or Scottish independence or Irish unification should be decided by referendum. I don't think there are many people at all who would disagree with that. And then there's a second argument, which you were alluding to there, which isn't so much an argument about why referendums are good, but why decision-making by elected representatives is bad, namely that the elected representatives have such strong vested interests in the issue at stake that they shouldn't really be making the decision. There's too much of a conflict of interest. And, that very clearly applies to something like the electoral system, for example. So, it seems to me very problematic for Parliament to decide its own electoral system. And now, whether referendums are always good mechanisms for deciding those sorts of issues, some of those issues are really quite nitty-gritty and technical issues, and is it really appropriate for a referendum to be deciding on those? But certainly some mechanism for bringing them out of the normal representative process would seem desirable. And if it's not a referendum, then, potentially you involve deliberative processes such as citizens' assemblies in a bigger way so that you can have a group of people who are looking in detail at that issue and coming up with some kind of recommendation. And then, of course, there's always the question with citizens' assemblies of, well, what happens to the recommendation? Maybe that then goes to referendum. Maybe it does go back to Parliament, but there's a kind of strong sort of moral pressure on Parliament not to deviate too far from a citizens' assembly recommendation, at least on an issue where Parliament itself is obviously rather conflicted. So on these sorts of constitutional issues, yes, I think there are good arguments for certainly removing elected representatives from their normal decision-making roles and potentially having a stronger role for referendums. I mean, moral issues are issues of conscience, the other area that you mentioned there that are quite interesting. And I mean, I guess it's a curious question. Why do we often think that moral issues are better suited to referendums? And I guess one point is that moral issues are just quite discrete. So people are often very concerned about holding referendums on questions around taxation and spending and that kind of thing, for example, because the obvious concern is that people will vote in a taxation referendum to have low taxes and in a spending referendum to have high spending, and that you need representatives thinking across these sorts of questions and thinking about producing a package that will look good after 4 or 5 years, rather than just voters looking at these issues in a disaggregated way. Whereas if you're voting on same-sex marriage or assisted dying or whatever it might be, it doesn't have these kinds of knock-on implications in other areas to the same degree that would be problematic. So some of the concerns about holding referendums are weaker on moral issues. But I suppose it's also the case that our politics tends to focus, and elections tend to focus on the big economic questions, or at least traditionally they have done so. They've been moving a bit away from that in recent years, but they have traditionally done so. So economic questions are in a sense decided, and we can see what the public think through elections, whereas we can't see what the public think on assisted dying from the 2024 general election campaign because it wasn't an issue and the parties didn't have positions in that campaign. But whether that's a kind of fundamental point about moral issues being more suited to referendums, or it just happens to be the case in how our party politics works at the moment that it's not structured around those issues and therefore those issues need to go to a different forum, is a harder matter to resolve, I guess.
I did find myself thinking during the recent assisted dying debate and then the vote in the House of Commons when MPs got up and talked about this as a matter they had discussed extensively with their constituents. They were very conscious that it wasn't just a question of them getting up and saying, although some of them did, this is what I happen to believe. Many of them felt this was a question that really mattered to a lot of the people that they represented. I did find myself thinking, well, why aren't we asking them directly? Why are we mediating on this question? Because this is an issue about which people feel very strongly. Many, many people have real lived experience of it, which is not true of many other questions that are decided in politics, or they have a very partial view. But I don't think anyone's experience of this really could plausibly be described as partial. It's the sort of thing that to have lived it is to have an understanding of it. And I did find myself struggling to understand why we weren't asking people directly that, unless it was that we've just lost faith in referendums, which maybe for other reasons and maybe for good reasons, it would just come out wrong if we did it. But it seemed that actually there was a principal case, and it did partly depend on the thought that having representatives either say, I feel very strongly about this, is a bit off because we might all feel very strongly about this, or saying, this is a question that I really must try and do what my constituents have told me. Well, it'll be a subset of the constituents. It won't be representative. There is a much more direct way of asking that question. I felt puzzled that the referendum option wasn't being pushed more strongly in that case.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. I think the concern would be that that is an issue on which, although many people do have strong feelings about it, it is nevertheless important that it's thought through carefully and deliberated appropriately, and that a referendum on its own would not give scope for that. And I think it is the case that people in the UK are very scarred by the experience of the Brexit referendum, which I don't think anyone on any side of that vote would argue that it was an example of high quality deliberation. So, if you think that that's what a referendum is going to be like, then you're unlikely to think that that would be a good way of deciding such a sensitive issue and a good way of debating such a sensitive issue. And there would be a concern also, I think, that the referendum would polarize the issue and could potentially lead to toxicity subsequently around the issue. Just as we saw polarization with Brexit and with Scottish independence, we can also see examples of very strong polarization around some moral issues. So it's not as though moral issues are immune to that kind of polarization. We've seen it on trans rights very obviously, for example. So, I think there would be a legitimate concern there. I mean, when I looked at that issue, I thought, well, this is a really good issue for a citizens' assembly. So to have a public deliberation and to ensure that that can be a really high quality public deliberation that does include regular members of the public rather than just politicians. And then quite possibly that would then lead on to a referendum. And we've seen examples in Ireland in recent years where there has been a citizens' assembly that has fed into deliberation in government and in parliament and then has gone to a referendum. And, there's good evidence that that kind of process can ensure, even at the referendum stage, you get a higher quality discussion, a discussion that doesn't become so polarized, in which there is recognition of the validity of arguments on both sides, and thereby you get a decision that has greater legitimacy in the long term.
On the question of constitutional issues and their suitability for a referendum, a border poll in Ireland, Scottish independence, and so on, and the reason that you gave, the principled reason, which makes a lot of sense, that sovereignty lent but not handed over on some things does need to be reclaimed if we're going to make a fundamental change in the way that sovereignty is exercised. There is another tradition. It's probably quaint, but I think it has some purchase on some of these questions, which is, yes, the run-of-the-mill representatives who have been elected in a general election can't also then start knocking down the walls. But actually, what we should do is have a separate assembly elected by the people, a constituent assembly of some kind, specifically elected for this question. So in order not to go down the referendum route with maybe some of its flaws and challenges, we have a body of people who have been chosen by the wider public and who have stood maybe on platforms. Now, this is the American model going way, way back. And they debate and discuss either the constitutional changes or merely the question of whether or not it's going to be endorsed. That idea feels like it's fallen away. I mean, occasionally in Britain, there's talk of the possibility of some kind of constituent assembly or some gathering of people elected for deciding on maybe more broad ranging constitutional reform. Do you think that way of doing it is just a kind of relic of the past, or does it potentially have teeth in these cases too?
Well, I think the difficult question for it is how do you constitute the Constituent Assembly?
The French Revolution seemed to produce books on almost nothing but that question.
But how do you constitute it in a way that doesn't just replicate the existing parliament? And one example where that has been attempted with, at least at the early stages, some success is Iceland, where following the financial collapse in, I think it was 2011, where this thing actually happened, there was an elected constituent assembly that was elected where no politicians took part. A different electoral system from usual was used, so it was based on individual candidates. It was a single transferable vote electoral system for the nerds, so based on individual candidates rather than political parties. And the people who were elected to that, there were some lawyers and constitutional experts and some nurses and some kind of television personalities. So they genuinely succeeded in constituting a constituent assembly that wasn't a replication of the existing political elite. And it produced quite a radical constitutional draft that many constitutional reformers saw as the golden future of how these things should be done and the kind of product that could be produced as a result. And that was put to referendum, or a series of referendums on different aspects of it, and was backed in the referendum, but that was merely an advisory referendum, and Parliament then decided not to implement it. So, at the last hurdle, it didn't actually go through, but the process in principle was one that looked quite good. But it was still a process where it was very clear from the start that the Constituent Assembly was going to draft something, but then that would go to a referendum. So I think you're probably right that it has just come to be seen as old-fashioned to think that it would be legitimate for elected representatives, even those elected representatives chosen for that specific purpose, to actually make the final decisions on that kind of issue.
So I'd like to talk about the Brexit referendum because, as you said, no one on any side, and there were only two sides, but it feels like there were many more than two sides, which is part of the problem, holds it up as a model of how to do this kind of thing. I don't think there's anyone who thinks it was a good example. They may be happy with the result, but the process itself, everyone has some problem with it. So if we take it as a benchmark of, in a way, how not to do a referendum, what are some of the things that could have been done differently in the case of the Brexit referendum? And this is not to produce a different outcome. And of course, part of the problem after the referendum is any suggestions of ways of doing it differently look like retrospective gerrymandering of a system, regardless of the outcome, that feel like they would have given it more possibility of satisfying both sides. What are some of the things that could have been done differently? So if we start with the question of the question, or the question of how questions are decided, how many options are available, and so on. Is there any way, do you think, that the Brexit referendum could have been approached differently?
Yeah, well, starting at the start is generally good, but particularly good in this case because how that referendum was called was crazy. It was called because David Cameron felt that he needed to cauterize the threat from UKIP in the run-up to the 2015 general election, and having a promise for a referendum on this issue was a way of doing so. And then when the legislation went through Parliament, there was no debate at all about the substance of the issue. There was some debate about how exactly the referendum would be conducted, but whether it was actually a good idea or not to leave the EU, whether there were other options that might satisfy the legitimate public concerns that existed, just wasn't subject to any debate whatsoever in Parliament or really in the media. So I absolutely do think that a better response, well, in a well-functioning democracy, a better response for David Cameron would have been to initiate some kind of national debate process around the issue of EU membership that might lead to a concrete proposal then being put to a referendum. And I mean, in my ideal world, because I work lots on citizens' assemblies as well as on referendums, would have been to have some kind of citizens' assembly in order to at least kickstart that kind of national debate process. I think it's probably fair that because we weren't in a world where many people had heard of citizens' assemblies in 2013, had David Cameron stood up and said, you can vote UKIP or you can vote for a citizens' assembly, he would have been laughed out of the park by the vast majority of commentators and journalists and so on. So that's why I said, in a well-functioning democracy, that is what I think should have happened. But whether there was a route to that happening in the UK democracy that existed at that time, I'm not so sure. So that's the start of the process, the referendum process. But then how the referendum was subsequently conducted was also very problematic. I mean, I guess there are bits of that it would be relatively easy to fix, and then there are bits of it that it would be very hard to fix. So in terms of, I say relatively easy to fix, the quality of the information that was available during the campaign, I think, is something that could be addressed. And if you look at referendums in some other countries that have a bit more referendum experience and a more positive experience of referendums, then there's a lot of focus on ensuring that there's good quality, impartial information that is available for voters and that is, properly distributed to voters through whatever modern means are appropriate, that help voters to understand what are the implications of the options on the ballot paper, what are the arguments, what different kinds of arguments are different people offering, what are the strengths and weaknesses of those arguments. So, it's hard when you start to try producing impartial information that is evaluating arguments being produced by others, because, of course, there are questions about what do we genuinely know. But there have been cases, I'm thinking particularly about a couple of referendums that have taken place in New Zealand on the voting system, where they have had experts on electoral systems produce quite detailed information setting out, here are the criteria by which electoral systems might be evaluated. Here's how each of the electoral systems on the ballot paper measures up against those criteria. That would be far harder to do on a topic like EU membership, because it's just a much, much more complex question. And I think it would also be far harder to do in the context of the contemporary UK political culture, which is just very, very combative and quite sceptical of experts. But then you can start thinking about, well, can we bring members of the public into this process of producing effective information? And one way of doing that has been explored, particularly in some US states. Oregon is the one that has gone further with this, having what they call their citizen initiative reviews, where essentially you have a bunch of people come together in the early stages of the referendum campaign, and they hear from the campaigners on both sides. They hear from experts of various different positions. They get a chance to probe the campaigners and say to them, no, we're not satisfied with your argument here. We want something more. We want to push you on these points. And then they write up a little report saying basically what they think of the arguments that have been presented to them and what overall conclusions they come to. And that's a way of injecting a bit of deliberativeness into the campaign process and a bit of thoughtfulness about the arguments in the campaign. And it's potentially then used by media outlets when they're interviewing campaigners, and, they can point out that, well, the members of the Citizen Initiative Review Panel thought that what you were saying on this is nonsense. So, you can be quite creative in working out ways in which you can improve the quality of information during a campaign. The hard bit, though, doing what I've just said well is really hard, but that's the relatively easy bit. The hard bit is the Brexit referendum was on an issue where it was a broad direction of travel or a principle rather than a worked out plan. So it was a referendum on leaving the EU, but there was no detailed vision or far less negotiated settlement on what form that future relationship would take, which meant that voters were voting in significant part in the dark, and campaigners were able to make all sorts of outlandish claims about what the implications of Brexit and what form Brexit might actually take. And this is really tricky because Brexit is one example of this kind of issue. Scottish independence is another one where you really have to have the referendum before you work out the detail. There's no way that the UK could have negotiated Brexit before having decided to do Brexit because the EU wouldn't have negotiated. So if we wanted to make that decision by referendum, the referendum had to take place before the negotiation. Similarly, with Scottish independence, no UK government is ever going to negotiate the terms of Scottish independence without the decision having been made already by the Scottish people. So how do you deal with that conundrum? And one idea that I've certainly explored and that I'm quite keen on is the idea that actually you should set up a double referendum process. So you should have a referendum on whether essentially to kickstart the process, but then you need to have another referendum once the detail is known to see, are people really still so sure that they want to go ahead with this? But that's problematic as well. It potentially sets up some difficult dynamics in the referendum campaign process and the negotiation of the deal. So it's far from straightforward either. But these kinds of issues are very, very difficult issues to deal with simply through one referendum vote.
On that question of having a two-stage process, Brexit has trashed the brand in so many ways. One of the brands it trashed is the idea of the second referendum, because that phrase then became associated with running it again so that we get the right answer. And there have been referendum processes, including on Europe, not in this country, but in other countries where that has happened. You do it again until you get the right answer. So the crucial thing would have to be that before the first referendum, the terms of the second referendum were known too. But that then connects to the question that you raised earlier about multiple options. There are two ways of thinking about this. One is that you can have more than one option on the ballot paper. So we tend to think of them as binary, and maybe they are clearer and cleaner when they're binary. But with the Scottish referendum, there was a question about having more than one option on the ballot paper, Devo Max, what it would mean to have a referendum where people were given an option which was neither just the status quo nor straightforward independence. What that would be in the Brexit case, I don't know. But you mentioned the New Zealand referendum on electoral reform. We, after all, in Britain had a referendum on electoral reform, which was the AV referendum. I imagine in that one, I can't really remember, but the quality of information probably wasn't great. But part of the reason was each side was just trying to trash the other side's position. There was no sense, as you described in the New Zealand case, of anyone saying, there are a range of options here. None of them are perfect, and you're to think about which one you prefer in the light of the perfection or imperfection of the other ones. Was there any way you think that could have been done either in the Scottish or in the Brexit case? It could have been done in the AV case, but does that actually itself presuppose a two-stage process? One, on the principle, do you want change? You've got to first pass the post system. Do you want change? Then you have a second referendum, either on a particular proposal or on a range of proposals? Or is there a way you could do both of those in the one vote?
You can do both in the one vote if you have a kind of preferential vote system. Whether that would necessarily lead to an outcome that people were really satisfied with and had legitimacy, I would have some concern about, just because the danger is people feel that the preferential vote is all quite complicated and they didn't really have the chance to weigh one option against another option. There were other options kind of in the mix. So I would tend, if you're going for a multi-option referendum, to favour a two-round process. I definitely wouldn't use the two-round process that you just described, where you have, firstly, a do you want change or not vote, because it may be that you want some kinds of change but not other kinds of change. So it may be that you're quite conflicted on how you're going to vote there, and that you end up getting, as a result of voting one way, the opposite of what you really wanted. So when there have been multi-option referendums, they've tended to involve first a referendum where there are various possible reforms on the ballot paper, and then there's a second round pitting the favoured option for reform against the status quo. One example of that is the first of the New Zealand electoral reform referendums. In 1992, they had a referendum where there were, if I remember correctly, 6 options on the ballot paper, and there was lots of debate about those 6 options. One of them came out fairly clearly ahead. And then that option was pitted against first past the post in a second referendum in 1993. And, I think that did work well. There are dangers with having multiple options that some campaigners might just no doubt will deliberately try to confuse people with all of that complexity. But certainly on some issues, I think you can see that kind of approach working.
I think that's an example of how we, or maybe I should say I, have been corrupted by Brexit, because I put it that way round because we've been talking about Brexit, and I was thinking, well, actually, the Brexit referendum it wasn't a vote for a thing called Brexit, because that didn't mean anything. It was a vote for change. I mean, Brexit meant change. There was the status quo or there was change. Then the question is, what kind of change do you want? And there was a wide range of options, and Parliament tried and cycled through endless permutations of these things, some of them quite complicated questions to do with our future relationship with Europe on economic matters, but there might be a broader way of doing it as well. And that change having been selected by the people then needed to be given the range of changes and asked to pick one. And it might include the status quo. I'm not thinking of this as a realistic option. I'm just thinking, I think in the back of my mind, I thought, well, given the first choice was for change, the problem was the people were never asked what kind of change they wanted. And when the options were laid out, there might have been a clearer answer. But even as I say it, I can see just how fantastically problematic that might be as you move from the first referendum to the second. And then you didn't even mention the other complicating factor in the Brexit referendum, which is it was an actual negotiation with people who had all sorts of interests, including interests in not agreeing to the things that many people in Britain might want. Once Brexit had been decided upon, it then became a negotiation with external players as well. But I think that was the thought in the back of my mind, which is that actually the vote for Brexit was simply a vote for change.
And I mean, I suppose if you had a second vote that was a version of change pitted against the status quo, but that essentially then devolves back to what I was initially suggesting about a two-stage referendum process, where you have first a vote on, do you want to explore some kind of change, and then you work out what it is and pit that against the status quo. Yeah, you're not really incorporating the multi-dimensionality or the multi-option aspect there.
So you talked about places that are more familiar with referendums. Part of the problem in Britain is that we've become familiar with them in a way in recent years. It's not the good kind of familiarity. People often think of Switzerland as a country that uses referendums extensively, and that's often held up as a good model. I don't know if it is or not. We can talk about that. You also mentioned the danger of disaggregated questions so that the voters are asked about, do you want to pay more tax? Would you like to spend more money? And they give contradictory answers. And California is sometimes held up as an example of a place that uses referendums and gets those kinds of outcomes. Do you think there is a place in the world, New Zealand might be one, which a country like Britain can look to as giving a good example of how you learn to embed this more in a representative democratic system? And do you think California is a good example of how not to do it?
Yes, certainly to California not being a good example. And I think part of the problem in California is, whereas in Switzerland you can't have referendums, or you can't have citizen-initiated referendums on questions of tax and spending, because there are basically three kinds of referendums in Switzerland. You can have constitutional referendums initiated by Parliament, you can have referendums on policy matters initiated by Parliament, and you can have constitutional referendums initiated by the public through petition. But you can't have a public-initiated referendum on lowering the tax rate, whereas you can have that in California. So, California does have this problem of disaggregating questions that really shouldn't be disaggregated and having voters vote on them individually, or at least it has sometimes had that problem. I mean, a lot of political scientists who work on California would say, yeah, these problems have been a bit exaggerated. So there have been some referendums where Californians have voted for higher taxes, and it's not all bad, but certainly there have been some problematic cases there. Switzerland is a much more positive example, and I have yet to meet a Swiss person, or at least a Swiss referendum expert, who doesn't say, yes, referendums are great. We show that it is possible to make referendums work well. And when you look at the detail of the Swiss system, it's really curious because there are very few rules around referendums and referendum campaigns in Switzerland. So there are no campaign spending limits, for example. There are no donation limits. So that some of the things that you would normally expect to see in order to ensure that you have a reasonably level playing field are not present. There is a really good quality information booklet, which is written by the government. And it all just works in part because there are very deeply embedded norms in place that the process will be respected and the government will not try to manipulate. And so the government is under an obligation to produce a leaflet that is impartial, or that gives both sides of the argument at least. But with that kind of obligation, it's potentially manipulable. But it's not really manipulated, or at least I've never spoken with any referendum expert in Switzerland who says it's manipulated. But for that reason, that's probably a difficult example for the UK to try to follow, because we clearly don't have those norms yet. And you need to have rules until the rules themselves and the practice originating from them starts to generate those norms. So somewhere like New Zealand, I think, does give good evidence from at least some of its referendums around really good use of public information campaigns. And one of the things I've always found most striking about New Zealand is the budget for the public information campaign, the impartial public information campaign, at least in some referendums, has been set 10 times higher than the maximum spending limit for the campaigners themselves. So there's a really strong and explicit intention behind that. And it's been said by politicians that the public information campaign will dominate the campaigning, and it will not be the campaigners that are dominating the campaigning. That's potentially clearly very dangerous if the public information campaign is corrupted or is just unconsciously biased in some way. So if you're going to do that, you need to be incredibly careful how you do it. But it does show that, you can take a very different approach to the approach that the UK has tended to take. And by that I mean the UK has tended to prioritise the rights of campaigners and emphasise the ability of the campaigners to express themselves, whereas New Zealand very much prioritises the rights of voters to get the information that they want in order to enable them to make a decision that they feel confident in. So I think thinking about just how you apply that in the UK context would require great care. But that ethos, that idea of how to approach a referendum campaign, I think New Zealand has gone further than anywhere else. I do think, compared to what has been done in New Zealand, you need to get away from just relying on experts in order to provide this kind of information. And you do need to bring the public into that process, into the deliberative process much more. But apart from that, I think the New Zealand model is quite a good one.
Yeah, it feels like if you were to apply that, anything like it in the British case, it's hard not to think of the Brexit case. That phrase you use, the information that the public want, that's the thing that would have to be given real teeth. Anything else wouldn't work, but there would have to be a real sense that the demand side of this was coming from the public and the supply was being created to meet the demand. In Switzerland, can citizens initiate a referendum on immigration, say? Or is that an unfair question to ask? Because immigration strikes me as somewhere between constitutional matters and tax and spend matters, but potentially problematic.
Depends on whether it's a constitutional issue in Switzerland, and I'm just not sure about that.
Immigration feels to me like one of those questions which is potentially very fraught as it intersects with the referendum model. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's a reflection of my own non-representative anxieties, but it feels like you can think of ways that could be a challenging subject, but also very tempting for the referendum model.
Yeah, I think that's right. One of the problems with referendums that I mentioned right at the start is that they are a pure form of majority rule. And if minority rights are at stake, then that can lead to very bad outcomes. And, it's been a concern also there have been a lot of referendums on same-sex marriage and other rights for gay people and lesbian people. And it's been very problematic in many of those cases. Trans rights have come up for referendum decision-making in some places, and the results have not been healthy. There have been some cases of very positive referendum debates on same-sex marriage. So Ireland, again, had a referendum on same-sex marriage that was conducted in a spirit that no one felt demonised by. But there were real concerns before that about how it would go. Similarly with the abortion referendum, the most recent abortion referendum in Ireland, there were many women in Ireland saying, how can it be that my rights to how I use my body are being decided by this electorate? And it was perceived by many as being deeply inappropriate that took place. So, immigration is an issue of particular political toxicity at the moment, but any kind of toxic issue like this where the rights of the minority are butting up against concerns that the majority feel can be absolutely vicious and best avoided.
I want to ask you about one last thing in relation to referendums, which takes us a bit away from what we've been talking about, partly because, as you have rightly pointed out, a lot of this does turn on not just the question, but the campaign. The way the referendum is conducted, these things happen over time. They are similar to, but in important ways different from, other kinds of electoral campaigns. Yeah, I remember at the dawn of the internet age, we were kind of promised a version of unmediated democracy because this technology was going to enable, apart from anything else, the bypassing of the campaign. There were visions of e-democracy. I think of this as probably peaking in about 1997, where the thought was with these new computers that we would have on our desks at home computers, there would be a direct line from us to government and government to us, and it would be possible to conduct referendums, as they were sometimes called, on a whole range of issues nightly. There was, it's a sort of, I don't know, fantasy version, a sci-fi version of politics, but still, it was a semi-serious idea, I think, that this technology, its point was it cut through some of the mediating infrastructure because there was much more direct communication. Now, in the period of the digital revolution, it feels like politics has become more mediated, as you were saying at the beginning. And referendums are also on the rise, but they're not on the rise through our laptops. I mean, old-fashioned referendums are on the rise. The number of referendums that are taking place around the world are what we've been talking about here. What happened to that idea? Was it nonsense? Do you think it was a fundamental misunderstanding either of referendums or of the technology? I kind of sometimes wonder where it went.
Well, to me, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of democracy. And it's imagining that democracy is just about voting and expressing your view, whereas actually most of democracy is about working out your view and working out what the options are on all of that stuff that precedes the vote. So, I mean, it seems to me that you just can't make that model of democracy work because either we're all making decisions without having thought about them, or we're spending all of our time thinking about decisions and not having time to do anything else. And the latter of those is just obviously not going to happen. Even I, as a total political junkie, don't want to spend all of my life pondering. So it would, in fact, be the undeliberated version. And actually, I think there are very few members of the public who think that's a good idea. We held a citizens' assembly on democracy in 2021, exploring people's ideas about how democracy should function. And they were kind of broadly positive about referendums and felt that referendums should play an important part in our democracy. But they were really concerned that if you're holding referendums, then they need to be conducted in a way that enables people to deliberate and learn about the issues and think about them and so on. And there's just no way you can do that if you have the people making nightly decisions. So it doesn't lead to good decision making. It doesn't lead to decisions that people feel happy with. It just leads to more and more frustration. So, yeah, I just think it can't practically work, not because of any limitations in the technology or in referendums in themselves, but because of an incompatibility between the nature of human beings and the fundamental nature of democracy that means that you cannot run democracy in that way.
So finally, why do you think the use of referendums is on the rise around the world? I believe it still is on the rise around the world.
Yeah, it's kind of plateaued a bit over the last few decades, but certainly it rose a lot from the kind of 1960s up to the 1990s, and it's maintained that kind of higher level since then. I mean, it depends a little bit on how you measure it.
So in a way, that was my question. Do you think that there is a natural peak of these things? So nightly referendums are a bad idea. The public, nonetheless, seem to want some referendums on some questions and recognize the merits of the referendum model, at least in some circumstances, if done in a responsible and informed way, and so on and so forth. And to do it in a responsible and informed way, you've given the New Zealand model, it's time consuming. Just one referendum is time consuming. It takes time. And if you're going to have a two-stage process to it, this is a matter of years, right? Not even of months. Do you think that there's a sort of limit, there's almost a natural limit in representative systems that almost certainly all representative systems are going to be tempted by referendums and may even need them at occasional points, but the system itself will almost insulate itself against them proliferating unless you're Switzerland and you have centuries of tradition of this, because to do it well is to do it slowly and expensively, essentially.
Yes, I wouldn't want to say that there's a kind of single point that you reach, because different countries do reach different equilibria, I think, probably. But I think it probably is a matter that each country comes to its own equilibrium point and then tends to stick around there in roughly the same place. So Switzerland has an equilibrium where people are fairly used to a vote up to 4 times a year, where there may be a few items on the ballot, and they get the leaflet through the post. Well, booklet is not just a little leaflet, it's a booklet explaining what they're voting on through the post or online, and they can think that through. And that seems not to be an unreasonable level of demand from the perspective of the average Swiss voter. I think voters in the UK are, at least at the moment, in a more sceptical equilibrium, where they see that there are absolutely some choices that must be made by referendum, and they want those choices to be made well. And it's not just me who says if there's any referendum in the future, it needs to be done not like the Brexit one. Pretty much everyone we speak to in the Citizens' Assembly and in focus groups and so on expresses the same sort of thought. So people do want referendums to be done well. And yeah, I think they see those as things that are done very occasionally on big issues that cannot be dealt with adequately through the political process.
We've had lots of really interesting feedback about this series, people sending in their own ideas about how democracy could go better and also asking questions. We've got a few more episodes to come, but at the end of the series, we are going to be trying to respond to some of those questions, but also talking about some of the ideas that you've suggested that we haven't got to. If you would like either to ask a question or just tell us what your idea is for a better democratic politics, just go to our website, ppfideas.com, and there is a contact page. There will be an episode at the end of this series with some responses. There are just a handful of tickets still left for the third film in our film season at the Regent Street Cinema in London. Films about big ideas. This one is a conversation with PPF regular Leah Ippey about a remarkable film that we will be screening, the biopic of the Marxist revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg. It's this coming Thursday the 9th of October. If you would like to join us, just click on the link in the show description, go to our website, ppfideas.com. It's very easy to get the tickets. We'd love to see you there. We will be putting all of the episodes that we are recording following these screenings out as a little season over Christmas. Next time in Fixing Democracy, we're going to be talking about an idea that I have to say I've been pretty sceptical about in the past, but it turns out to have a fascinating history and also all sorts of interesting implications. We're discussing whether voting should be made compulsory. That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.